I go for refuge until I'm enlightened. To the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the means I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye Chodan Soki Chonam La Jonshu Bardu Dagni Kapsuchi Dagi Chonen Gepe Sonangi Drola Penshir Sange Drupa Sho Sange Chodan Soki Chonam La Jonshu Bardu Dagni Kapsuchi Dagi Chonen Gepe Sognangi Jola Penshir Sange Drupar Sho.
Thank you, Mary. All right, everyone, let's just do a short meditation. And I always like to start the teaching with an opportunity for us to meditate together. We'll spend the first few minutes just focusing on the breath. The breath is with us all the time. Good meditation object. You can choose whatever way to work with the breath that you prefer. If you need a suggestion, then I'll suggest tuning into the sensation around the nostrils, where you feel the air coming in and going back out. And just try to stay present with that sensation as best as you can. But whenever you see that the mind has wandered away from the breath, then just let go of whatever distracted you and guide the mind gently back to the breath. So we're going to do this in silence for just a few minutes, and then I'll lead you in a short reflection to set our motivation for our time together today. So we can begin now. So now to set our motivation together, let's start with the very basic beginning point for all of the Buddhist teachings, which is simply this fact that all sentient beings, including ourselves, have a fundamental desire to be happy, to avoid suffering. And the Buddha never said there was anything wrong with that urge, that desire. It's the starting point. That in the Buddha's observation, we're going about obtaining happiness and avoiding suffering in the wrong way. We look outside of ourselves, trying to eliminate those things that cause us pain or difficulty, and to acquire the things that bring us happiness and pleasure. And the problem is those experiences outside ourselves are not lasting. They will not do the trick. The Buddha says the sources of well-being are within ourselves, within our own minds. So in this course, we're going to be examining this profound topic of mind training, lojong, this unique way of working with whatever it is that we meet and transforming it into the path, helping to develop our qualities within, helping us to deepen our understanding of the Buddha's teachings and to attain realizations by doing this. So these teachings are rooted in the Mahayana, the idea that every single one of us can become a Buddha. We have the raw material from which that will develop. It is, in fact, our own minds that develop into that state. So within this context of knowing that we have the potential to develop our minds to that degree, and moreover, every single sentient being also possesses that potential, we can then generate the Mahayana motivation, the motivation to achieve enlightenment ourselves, to develop our own minds to that degree, so that we then can perfectly help other beings to do the same thing. Because we have the potential and they have the potential, we therefore can be dedicated to achieving Buddhahood for the sake of all beings so they can also attain that same state. And this is the best motivation to bring to these mind training teachings. So if we work with this in a lesser capacity, then we will have lesser results. But if we work with this within the idea of each of us becoming enlightened, then that is the result that we will attain. So we can try to hold this thought, what we call bodhicitta, the wish to become a Buddha for the benefit of all beings, and think that it's for this reason that you're here to engage in these teachings on mind training. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes fully, and we'll begin. So again, thank you for inviting me to teach this course in particular for these Sundays in December. Always a topical course because we're never without problems or suffering. Is anyone in the room without suffering or problems? Anyone? Yeah. So we have these constantly in our lives, and we need to have more skills to work with those experiences. So I will mention that there is a text that I'll be using for this, and the text I'm just going to share on screen where it's available, just so you know, in case you didn't see the link before coming in today. This is the page at the website for the Buddhist Center that this course is advertised on. If you scroll down, you'll see that there's a course materials link. You can click on that, and it will take you to a Google Drive that I've set up. I will have some additional folders after today. I'm going to add a folder for the presentation slides I'm going to use today. But this is where we find the text. It's called Transforming Suffering and Happiness. We'll touch on the latter part of that, transforming happiness, a little bit later in the course. But this is the text that we're going to be using for this. And again, I'll make reference to it later. But I just wanted to make sure that people know that that is out there. And that's the main text that I'll be going through for these 4 Sundays. So these teachings, as I mentioned in the motivation, are very much rooted in what we call the Mahayana. You just review very briefly, for those of you who've been attending Geshe Sherab's teachings before he left, he was going through the Lam Rim, the stages of the path. The Lam Rim is a wonderful structure that was put together about 1,000 years ago, based on the Buddha's teachings, by Lama Atisha, this wonderful Indian master who came to Tibet. And there are many different versions of the Lam Rim, but they all contain the very essential teachings that are necessary for us to become enlightened. So Lam Rim, stages of the path, as it's usually translated, gives us a sequential way of working with the Buddha's teachings, set up in terms of essentially 3 main categories. There are some preliminary teachings that feed into that. For example, understanding that we all have this amazing, perfect human life that we can use for our spiritual progress. And secondly, that we've met with the Dharma through the kindness of our gurus, our teachers, who exemplify the teachings for us and who also give us the advice and guidance that we need. So these 2 preliminary thoughts inform the entire stages of the path. But again, it's set up in terms of 3 levels, comparable to the way that we have education in our school systems, right? When a child's 5 years old, you might want them to go to a university, but you don't take them to a university at 5 years old because they haven't done all the training that's necessary to be able to make good use of that time. So instead, you take them to elementary school, and then you take them on to high school, and then you take them to university, and maybe even graduate studies or whatever might be necessary. But you do that within the understanding that you can't have perfect knowledge right from the beginning of the higher level teachings. You need to be gradually developing them. The 3 stages of development, once more, just to remind those of you who've been studying the Lam Rim, are first of all the teachings for the person of the least capacity, meaning that they are at least going to turn their minds in a direction of the Buddhist teachings, the Dharma, but they're not necessarily going to go for more deeper, more long-lasting results. These are the teachings that help us to attain a good rebirth. In Buddhism, rebirth is a concept that is taught on the basis of mind, that mind has a continuity. Every one of you has a mind. It's not new to this life. It existed prior to this life because mind arises from prior moments of mind. Mind is not a physical, material phenomenon. Rather, it has its non-material entity that is in the nature of knowing, having an experience. That continuity of awareness goes back without any beginning and goes forward without any end. So essentially, rebirth is the process by which that mind goes through different experiences within what we call cyclic existence. The very first level of practice, of course, is to be concerned about what comes after this life. Because when this life ends, our consciousness will go on. And do we want to end up in an unfortunate state, or do we want to have the good conditions for spiritual practice that we currently possess? So that's the very first level of spiritual practice. The second level is where we look at that big picture of cyclic existence, going from life to life. And even if we get a good rebirth, and that will be, certainly a much better experience than ending up in an unfortunate state, we are going to have to continue on that treadmill, that cycle of life, until we can attain freedom. So at the second level of practice, we desire that freedom. We develop an aspiration for it based on renouncing the aspects of samsara that we see are faulty, coming to really understand that it's by nature not a ideal place to be. I often refer to samsara, this cyclic existence, as being like a prison. We have been caught in this prison going from life to life since beginningless time. So the second level of aspiration is for a much more, a deeper result, a more lasting result, and something, again, that we can see is important in our spiritual progress. So those first 2 levels are really self-compassion. They're really looking at ourselves and seeing our own situation clearly, and understanding that we are the creators of our own experience. If we want to continue to have this kind of a conditioned existence going from life to life, then that's our choice. If we want to break free from it, well, then we can also make that decision. So that's the second level of practice. The third level is where we open up with this mind of bodhicitta that we just meditated on, where we see that we're not alone in our predicament. Every single being is in the same conditioned existence that we are. And moreover, we are connected to those beings. we experience everything we have in our lives that brings us any measure of happiness or well-being on the basis of others. It's all interconnected. So at this third level, we look at the big picture in terms of all beings and generate bodhicitta, the aspiration to go beyond just our own freedom from suffering, our own freedom from cyclic existence, and develop our minds completely into the state of Buddhahood, where we then can lead all beings to that state. Because the state of Buddhahood is a state where we will have an omniscient mind, a mind that knows all phenomena and therefore knows exactly how to benefit others. So that in a nutshell, we're going to be touching on the Lamrim as we go through this course, because of course, we're talking about how do we transform any problematic experiences we have into an understanding and development of realizations of the path. That's the whole purpose of it, is to use those opportunities as a way to develop and deepen our practice. So our practice essentially comes down to those three levels. So we are talking about doing all of this work, though, within the highest level. As I said in the motivation, our ideal aspiration is to want to benefit all sentient beings and to cultivate that mind that is here for that purpose. Because even though we're going to work with teachings that are in the first and the second levels for the people of a lower capacity, we're going to be doing it entirely with the aim of achieving enlightenment, Buddhahood. Again, the most far-reaching goal that we can attain. So that's the understanding behind what we're going to be looking at in this course. These teachings are generally set out within that third level of the stages of the path as a way to develop this mind training, or lojong as it's called in Tibetan. To get things started, I do want to share a little quote from Lama Zopa Rinpoche that speaks to what I was saying at the very beginning of our motivation today. This is, again, pertaining to how our minds are the creator of our experience. If you closely examine your own experience, Rinpoche says, you will see that happiness and suffering are dependent upon your mind, upon your interpretation of events and circumstances. Happiness and suffering do not come from outside, from others. All of your happiness and all of your suffering are created by you, by your own mind and motivation. This is, again, a very powerful quote to point out the power of our minds. You know, the fact that it is our minds interpreting and looking at things that dictates how we then experience them. This is one of the main things we're going to be touching on today and throughout this course, is really the fact that how we are actually experiencing something comes down to how we are framing it with our own thoughts. And when I think about this idea of dealing with suffering, sometimes the example that I use are those people who train for the Ironman competition. It should be called Iron Person competition, by the way. I don't know why they gave it such a gender-specific term, but because women do this as well, right? You know, it doesn't depend upon your gender whether you can be an Ironman, but it involves like these grueling training, and then the actual competition itself involves all this swimming and bicycling and riding, and then a marathon at the end of it. It's like, it's grueling. People actually break limbs doing this sometimes. I mean, it's so intense. That's a form of suffering that I would want to avoid, right? Many of you in the room are kind of nodding your heads in the same way. Like, you can't imagine putting yourself through all of that unbelievably taxing training in order to just accomplish having completed one of these things or won a competition in regard to them or what have you. But the people who do that see it totally different, right? And they are excited to train for that. And when they have challenges and obstacles in their progress to achieving that kind of perfection that will allow them to do that competition well, they actually take delight in that, right? They think, this is how I'm actually going to push myself. We see this with Olympic athletes too, right? They want things that are going to push them beyond their own boundaries. We're kind of looking at our problems and difficulties in a similar light. We have the opportunity to choose how we are going to see what we experience. Is it going to become debilitating, an obstacle, something in our way? Are we going to embrace it as an actual opportunity to deepen our practice? So this is what we're mainly focused on. This is the big teaching out of today. If you walk away from today with nothing else but this, then you will have at least the stepping stone that allows you to engage in mind training at the deepest level. All comes down to how you're choosing to look at it. Again, we all have problems, we all have suffering, we all have difficulties. But are we going to choose to see them in that light and once more as obstacles, as things that stop us in our path, rather than invite us in and welcome us as an opportunity to practice and to deepen our own understanding? So this is the idea behind this. I'm going to share a few more slides here. I don't have too many slides for today, I don't think, but I do have a few things that I want to introduce you to. First is to this idea of what is lojong. I'm giving you there on the where the words are in italics. Those are the Tibetan in what's called Wylie. Tibetan characters are on the right-hand side there on the screen. And so in order to be able to put those characters into a way that we could understand them through kind of a transliteration of them, we are using English letters. And so you have a ba and a L and a la and a o sound, a naro on that first thing that's right there. Let me see if I can get my cursor over there. That's the first character. It's pronounced lo, though, and lo is translated usually as mind, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And then the second character is a sa with a ba underneath it as a subscript, and then a ya, which is giving it kind of this J sound, ja, and then again the same O sound that's at the top, and then that's with a suffix of a nga sound, nga. So you get jong, lo jong. Jong is usually translated as mind training. Sometimes you'll see this in different ways, but on the very next slide, I'm going to talk about the different meanings that we can attribute to this. Lo, of course, we usually translate as mind, but I want to elaborate on what we mean by mind. We usually use these synonyms, awareness, consciousness, or in this context specifically, we talk about thoughts and attitudes. So sometimes this is even called thought transformation or thought training, the idea being that we are working with transforming our thoughts. Of course, within the context of mind, we have different experiences. I'm going to be going into this on the Wednesday night course, or Getting to Know Your Mind, I think is the title we gave to that, where we're going to examine mind in the more traditional ways that it's set out in Buddhism, but also gain a deeper appreciation for the practical aspects of those teachings. But mind is in the nature of experience. It is, again, that non-material phenomenon that is arising moment by moment. It's better to think of it as a stream of awareness as opposed to concrete individual moments. But it has different elements of that experience. Sometimes we are knowing things through our senses, right? Our five senses are active frequently, and we're getting things through our eyes, through your ears, as you're doing now and listening to these teachings, through your nose, your tongue, through your body, tactile sensations, and what have you. Those are very direct ways of knowing. The data appears to us, and we simply know it through our senses being active, and our sense consciousness is becoming aware of those. However, when we start working with our mental consciousness, which has its own way of arising, it tends to be primarily in the domain of our thoughts. And our thoughts, of course, are creations of our mind. They are based on the kind of conventional reality that we are all creating in terms of how we look at things and define things. So we identify what things are, and we also give different qualities to things on the basis of our thought processes. Our thinking mind is the real workshop in Buddhism, because that's what we have to change. We have more habitual thoughts that we tend to follow, that see things in a particular light and interpret them in that way. But we have healthier ways of doing that we can practice and that we can become familiar with. And that's, of course, what we're talking about in these mind training teachings. Very specific genre of teachings that the Buddha gave that were, again, developed to a greater degree as these teachings came into Tibet about 1,000 years ago. And they give us an opportunity to change our thoughts, to become familiar with different ways of thinking. There was that wonderful bumper sticker that everybody had on their car. It seemed, don't believe everything you think, right? Well, I would say again, you can believe some things you think, but there's a good share of what you think that you're probably believing in erroneously. And of course, when we get to the deeper teachings, which we will touch on in this course as well, when the Buddha gets to examining what is the real nature of reality, what are the false thoughts we have about how even things exist, much less the qualities or attributes that we're giving to them. then we see again that we can change our thoughts at an even deeper level. But our thought training is really the main gist of all of this. We use the word mind training, but we're really talking about thought transformation or changing our attitudes, as was said in that line there, kind of giving a deeper description of what we mean by the word lo in Tibetan. Now, the word dong has several interrelated but distinct meanings. These are set out by Tibetan Jinpa in his book on mind training. The first one is training, where we acquire a skill or you master a field of knowledge. This is an important part of it, right? Training is a good part of what we do in Buddhism. We train in doing things differently, in looking at things more correctly. This is an important part of this phrase, lojong. A second aspect of it, though, is habituation or familiarization with specific ways of being and thinking. So again, it does mean that we then have to, understand the different ways that we can look at something and become more familiar with them over time. We are essentially creatures of habit, and our minds are products of our habitual thinking. What we are trying to do is to change that habituation. Remember that the word in Tibetan that we use for meditation is gom. We even refer to this space that we're in as gompa, a place of meditation. But meditation has that connotation of familiarization, becoming familiar with our own minds, becoming familiar with the Buddha's teachings and integrating them into our own minds. So this is an important aspect of our training here too, when we talk about lojong, entailing training, habituation. The third element, cultivation, cultivating specific mental qualities such as universal compassion or bodhicitta, the awakening mind. So again, these are also an aspect of our mind training. We're talking about developing qualities that are more wholesome and helpful for us in the face of our own suffering or our own difficulties, rather than going to places of having more delusion, having more false thinking, what have you. So we're going to see that coming up as well. A fourth element in regard to the meaning of this word zhong is cleansing or purifying, as in purifying one's mind of craving, hatred, and delusion. This is an important aspect to it. When we talk about when we're working on our minds, we are essentially doing kind of two main things. One is to purify the negative tendencies that we have. But how do we do that? The main tool that we're going to be using in these teachings is to replace that way of thinking with things that are more positive, things that, again, are more in line with truth, things that actually generate better, deeper qualities for ourselves, make us more in touch with our very nature and more capable of helping others on the basis of that. So we always have these two kind of things operating. One is to remove the negative tendencies, the other is to develop the positive ones. And in fact, as many of you know, the Tibetan word for Buddha, Sangye, which we recited when we did the refuge verse, it was the very first word of that verse, right, in Tibetan. Sangye has both of those connotations. Sang means to completely purify, completely remove all of our negative tendencies, which the Buddha says is completely possible because those things don't reside in the very nature of our minds. They are things we have become habituated towards, that we increase through the force of habit. And they can be removed by especially developing the positive qualities, those things that are more in line with reality. That's the meaning of the word ye, to fully develop everything that is positive. This is our birthright. We all have Sangye nature, Buddha nature. We all have the ability to completely free our minds of everything that is negative and to completely develop everything that is positive. Mind training is one specific genre of teachings that help us to do this work in line with the Lam Rim, in line with our understanding of the teachings of the Buddha and how we can develop our minds gradually towards that goal of enlightenment. Again, completely removing everything that is negative, completely developing everything that is positive. So that's just, again, to give you an understanding of kind of the complexity and the depth of what we're working with in this teaching on what we, again, are calling lojong, or we're just going to use mind training as the main translation, but know that you will see it in different ways, especially thought transformation. So now on the screen, I'm just reminding us that all of the Buddhist teachings are essentially mind training in a sense, But the use of this term here refers more specifically to a lineage of extraordinary teachings that are designed to help us to use whatever we meet to awaken fully. So again, everything the Buddha taught is to work with our minds. As I mentioned in the motivation, that's the source of all of our happiness, all of our suffering. Rinpoche reiterated it with that quote that I gave you earlier. Everything is to train our minds. But here we're talking about a specific genre of teachings that help us to use, especially our problems, this is the main focus of this course, as a doorway for developing ourselves towards enlightenment, to awaken fully rather than, again, to see them as obstacles. The mind training teachings, as their name implies, chiefly concern ways and means of shaping the mind. This is particularly relevant to a Dharma practitioner. Unless we are able to train our minds so that they can withstand the ups and downs of life, it will be hard to continue our spiritual endeavor. So these are some words from His Holiness the Dalai Lama, a wonderful book that he has about the Geshe Chikawa's 7-point mind training that I'm going to touch on briefly in a moment. We see that this is an absolutely essential tool for us to have, because otherwise we are going to go through our lives like a yo-yo. We're going to get all elated when everything is wonderful and everything's smooth and everything's happening the way we want it to be. And then we're going to drop to the depths of our despair and depression when things go the opposite. And we'll just keep going back and forth, vacillating on this. And in the course of a day, maybe this is your homework for the week, just watch how your own mind does that. You get up and maybe you have an initial sort of positive thought and you're thinking, oh, great, things are going to happen. It's going to be a wonderful day. And then you go outside and something starts to go wrong. The car doesn't start the right way, or there's problems with the traffic, or something else happens. And you see that your mind just keeps bending back and forth, going from elation to depression, depending upon what's going on outside of you. We need this kind of even-keeled mind that's going to be able to look at whatever is happening as an opportunity to transform. Again, primarily the problems. Why? Because they are the most difficult thing for us, right? They cause us the most painful emotions when we have problems and difficulties in our lives. But we need to even transform the happy experiences. That's why this text is called Transforming Suffering and Happiness into the Path. Because whatever is going on, we can't get kind of caught up in this dualistic kind of approach to things. That's what His Holiness goes on to talk about. Let me share you a few more of his words, because I think they're really very, very wonderful, and they speak to all of us as Dharma practitioners. Two situations can hamper our Dharma practice. I've inserted these numbers here. One is when we are well off and everything goes smoothly with no obvious hindrances. Maybe you've had that for a few minutes today, maybe. I'm just kind of joking. Maybe we have it for longer, but nonetheless, this can be a problem, believe it or not. The second one, is when we are beset by continual hardships and disasters, when things don't go the way we want them to be. So in the first case, His Holiness says, the mind becomes inflated and arrogant. This leads to other disturbing emotions like jealousy and competitiveness. We must not allow ourselves to be carried away by the wind of such negative forces. On the contrary, we should learn to turn the situation to our advantage. So the idea again is that when we see what happens to us, we become a bit complacent sometimes when things are going well. We think, oh, wow, this Dharma stuff really works. I don't really have to practice so hard because my life's going smooth now. Everything's wonderful. Everything's peachy keen. Of course, that bubble bursts pretty quickly, right? Because something will inevitably happen that shows us that we can't really rely upon that. So rather than resting on our laurels, we need to make sure that even those experiences that we find to be happy and pleasant, that we don't fall into that complacent mode, that we actually look at that as also an opportunity to work with our minds. Of course, to not get so attached to it, to not get caught up in those patterns His Holiness mentioned of jealousy, competitiveness, what have you, right? To recognize that these are actually, once more, all opportunities for practice, all grist for the mill, as they often say. Everything we meet, every experience in our lives. Then he goes on to say, it would be wiser then at those times to take a more wholesome view and reflect that we are able to enjoy good fortune and comfort now because of our past good actions. we can make a wish that others enjoy the same as well. I mean, there's nothing wrong with kind of thinking that we can share our experiences of happiness with others. But one of the main points that's here, and this is going to be something I hope to get to today, is really emphasizing this idea that one of the foundational teachings for understanding the effectiveness of lojong, of mind training, is the principle of karma. Well, karma means that essentially what we are experiencing is not just interpreted by our minds in the present moment, but it is created by what we have done with our minds in the past. Now, this is one of the toughest concepts for Westerners to get and for them to accept, but nonetheless, it is really key throughout the entire stages of the path. Venerable Dundrup, one of the monks in our tradition, Australian man, he emphasizes in his teachings on karma that are part of the Discovering Buddhism module, that this is perhaps the most important teaching the Buddha gave, is the teachings on karma. Why? Because if we begin to take that level of responsibility, recognizing that we are the creators, not just of our experience in terms of, once more, how we're interpreting it in the moment, but also how, through our past actions, we have informed that experience. That experience is a product of our past actions. Well, then it's all stuff that we can work with, right? What is ripening in our lives is bringing us exactly something that we need to see, that we need to understand. If we have good things happening in our lives, as His Holiness is pointing out here, well, those things didn't come from, luck or from some beneficent being, showering you with blessings. They came from your own good karma, your own good actions. If you want to continue to have those good experiences in your life, you need to invest in creating similar karma now. And you have to, of course, make sure that you continue to do that in the future. This is one of the most fundamental teachings the Buddha gave, but so important on our path. If we are not taking charge of our own actions, then I don't even know if we can be described as really being Buddhist. That is really the fundamental bottom line. That's taught in the first level of the teachings of the stages of the path. That's the very foundation of understanding how you get a good rebirth. But it also it has its relevance in terms of how we attain liberation, how we attain enlightenment. Everything is the product of causes and conditions. The most fundamental one being our own karma, our own past actions. So, when we have good things happening in our lives, it reminds us that those things don't come from nowhere. They came from our own good actions of the past. And we can delight in that we have engaged in that, and dedicate ourselves to doing that in the future, wish others to have good results in their lives, kind of enlarge our loving kindness for other beings at that time. And we'll touch on this idea later in this course, because our text also gives advice, as I said, about how to work with happiness in our lives. Let's talk about the main focus for this course. His Holiness points out, of course, the other thing that happens frequently. When we are faced with various difficulties and misfortunes, we can easily become depressed. This is when we must be particularly careful and resilient. Otherwise, our problems can overwhelm us, and we may lose our hope and direction. It is important to recognize these two potentially disruptive situations and prepare accordingly. The first one, again, when things are going smooth and everything's hunky-dory. And then the second one, when the shit hits the fan, right? As they say, when everything is not going our way at all. I mean, it's just interesting. I do hear people sometimes, even not, maybe they don't completely give up on Buddhism, but they might make comments like, oh, this Buddhism stuff doesn't work. Look, I've been practicing all these years, and I still have so many problems and difficulties in my life. Well, again, that's a wrong interpretation. We are dealing with, first of all, minds that are beginningless. We've been creating karma since beginningless time. And we have been doing that generally under the influence of our deluded minds, rarely even engaging in what is virtuous and wholesome, tending to do what is non-virtuous and unwholesome. Well, no wonder we have problems and difficulties in our lives. No wonder this world is plagued by lots of, strife and climate change and, election anxiety and all the things we've had to deal with this year. All of this is a product of our own deluded minds. We are all the creators of these problems and difficulties. So this is, again, the understanding we have to have with regard to those two situations. They're not coming upon you, and you're going to kind of find someone to blame when it's things are going wrong. But rather, the idea is that we are the creators of that. So we should be able to embrace those things and say, okay, I created it. What are the lessons that are behind it? Pema Chodron often speaks of this in the way she approaches karma in her teachings on mind training. That essentially karma is life giving you the lessons you need to learn. Which I think is a wonderful way to frame it, right? To say, okay, I'm going to be experiencing things throughout every day of my life. If I look at whatever it is as a product of my own past actions, well, then there's something to be learned from every one of those things. In terms of the positive things, the happiness experiences, well, then I can see what did I do to create those? How did I actually create the good fortune that I'm now experiencing? With regard to the problems, the difficulties, well, how did I create those? Can I take ownership of that? And can I see that this is to help me to deepen my understanding of the Dharma and utilize what is happening that I'm identifying as a problem as actually a way to deep dive deeply into what is the potential that I can kind of generate from the basis of that problem. What is the understanding that I can increase in terms of my own investigation of the teachings of the Lam Rim? So this is the idea behind it, is that everything is a karmic creation, and therefore everything has a lesson for us. And one thing I want to say before we go too far in this is that these teachings are primarily for us to work on ourselves. I know that there's this way that a lot of people have. I even see it, people posting on Facebook frequently, things that you're kind of telling people who are having problems or difficulties that they need to see the positive in it and da 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 da. Some people aren't ready for these teachings. So don't think that as you're gaining some skill in these teachings that they become things that you can easily dole out to others. Somebody calls you and they say, oh, I just broke up with my partner of so many years and I'm having a really hard time. And you say, well, have you seen it through the lens of your own karma and da 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 da? You don't just like start throwing these teachings at people because people are not necessarily going to be receptive to them, right? So we have to, once more, dial it in and say, these teachings are a mirror for ourselves. If we feel that someone that we are close to is in a position that we can share them and that we have permission to share them, then maybe we can begin to share them with others. But they're primarily a tool for looking at our own stuff. And when I received some teachings from, I can never remember his name because it was many years ago in San Francisco, on another mind training text called The Wheel of Sharp Weapons. This Lama said, as you go through this text, you're going to see many things that you go, oh yeah, I know a person like that. Oh yeah, I know somebody who's thinking that way, or I know somebody who's having that problem. That's not the purpose of these teachings, for you to be able to identify everyone else's stuff. This is so you can identify your stuff. So that's what makes it particularly challenging too, is because this is opening our own minds to looking at our garbage. I'll share a quote from Venerable Robina. She said it was from somebody else, but I don't remember who it was, but it's so Venerable Robina. Many of you have heard it before. She said, being a good Buddhist doesn't mean kind of sitting there all serenely with like everything being kind of mellow and wonderful and delightful. She says, being a good Buddhist means having your hands in your own shit. And that's essentially what our job is as Dharma practitioners, is to look at our own stuff. If we aren't owning up to our own stuff, then again, I don't know what we're doing. Kind of acquiring teachings and developing some knowledge and understanding of this or that. But if we aren't actually looking at our own minds and trying to reverse the ways that we are looking at things, the attitudes we have that are not in line with reality, then our Buddhist path is really pretty futile. I'm not saying there's no merit to just acquiring some level of understanding of the teachings, but that's like somebody who acquires medicine that's really powerful and they just store it in a medicine cabinet and they show it to everybody. You want to see all my wonderful medicine? But you never took it? No, I've never taken it, but it's really wonderful medicine. Well, how do you know? You have to take the medicine. That's why the Dharma is often, in the analogy of the Buddha being the perfect doctor, the Dharma is the perfect medicine. But the doctor can't heal you if you don't take the medicine, folks. So just my little plug for that. Make sure that as we go through these teachings, we really see this from the vantage point of these are teachings that I need to apply in my own mind. His Holiness continues. He says here, although the purpose of our spiritual endeavor is to gain freedom from problems and enjoy peace and success. Things may not work out as intended. In fact, they aren't working out every day as intended, I'm sure. It may happen that we seem to experience greater hardship and actually increased difficulties. At such a juncture, you should not allow narrow considerations to dominate, but should view things in a broader context. So again, you might have that good intention, and there is nothing wrong with that starting point, as I mentioned in the motivation today. There's nothing wrong with saying the Buddhist teachings are here to help us to achieve the happiness we seek and to be free from the suffering we wish to avoid. But guess what, folks? Just that aspiration alone isn't enough. We're going to experience problems. You're going to get intoxicated by happiness and pleasure too. You need to find tools to work with those, to see things again in a broader context, as His Holiness is pointing out. As many texts on logic explain, because every single phenomenon has countless aspects, much depends on what angle you view it from, what your perspective is. For example, when you encounter suffering, if you think only of suffering, then it is intolerable. But if you forget that aspect, you may be able to see it from another angle. This is really the heart of mind training, as I mentioned a short while ago, right? How are we choosing to see our suffering? If you're going to put that label of suffering on it, problem, obstacle, difficulty, well, then that's how you're going to experience it. If you look at it as opportunity, an opening, something that will help us to deepen and grow our practice, well, then that's how you're going to relate to it. It really comes down to your own mind. The nature of suffering changes depending upon your mental attitude and the way you look at it. If you're able to transform adverse situations into factors of the spiritual path, hindrances will soon become favorable conditions for spiritual practice. We may get to that point where eventually you even look forward to problems in your life. Oh, yay, this has happened. I have something wonderful to work with, right? And Rinpoche has his own analogy for that I'll share at a later point. But this is the way that we need to change our attitude, change our thinking. Okay? Just one or two more quotes, I think, here from His Holiness. I just found his words here quite rich. So, through accustoming your mind to such a practice, you will meet with success and nothing will hinder your spiritual progress. It is said that being able to transmute adverse situations in this way is a sign that you are really undergoing spiritual training. In other words, you're doing what Venerable Rabina says. You're really working with your own stuff, with your own shit, with your own mind. So this is really the measure of it. Are we letting ourselves get bogged down, depressed, bothered by our problems and difficulties? Or are we actually uplifted when we see these things and go, oh, good, a new lesson, something more to learn, right? Everything has a lesson embedded in it. Again, once more, I wouldn't give that advice to just anybody on the street. Oh, you're homeless, you need to learn the lesson from that. That's not the way you would interpret and be kind to that person. You would say, oh, what can I do for you? I'm sorry that you're in the situation you're in, and try to help people. That's your compassionate response to the suffering of others. When we look at our own selves, we want to be able to transmute that suffering experience, to make it into something that becomes fertile soil for us to grow realizations. So that's the concept behind it. Before we go too far on this, I do want to share a few skills. I think this is the next slide. Skills that are essential, or tools that are essential in practicing mind training. I'm not going to be teaching on all of these to give you kind of the raw material to do this. This is for you to develop in your own practice. The very first one I put on there is willingness. We don't use the word willingness so much in Buddhism, but willingness is important. Within the understanding that our minds can change, we have to be willing to engage in that process. A lot of people aren't willing to change. And even some people who come to Buddhism, they hear it and they go, oh, this is all really wonderful teachings, but I'm not for me. I'm not going to change my mind. I'm not going to go and become something different. We have to really be willing, within the understanding that we have the potential to change our minds. Once more, all that stuff that we want to remove, it's not fixed in our minds. It's there because we've created the patterns for it to be there. All the positive stuff can be generated to an infinite degree because our minds are completely a product of our own familiarization. So it's up to us. What do we want to develop? it's our own willingness that's going to be the key as to whether mind training is something we can do or not. The next two tools are tools we develop in our meditation. Again, I'm not going to teach on meditation. If you need more experience or practical teachings on developing mindfulness and introspection, then there are plenty of opportunities to do that. Mindfulness in this context is the ability to stay aware of what we're doing, to not forget what we are doing. I like to contrast it with the word mindlessness. We go about a lot of our day mindless, just kind of on autopilot, just kind of doing what we naturally do and not even thinking about it. You have to be aware of what is going on, especially within your own mind. Lama Zopa Rinpoche, when he would teach on mindfulness, because mindfulness has gotten to be a really big thing in our culture, right? We even use this term mindfulness now because it's just like everywhere, right? But mindfulness is a tool. It's something that we can use. Rinpoche would always say, mindful of what? What are you being mindful of? If you're simply just being mindful of the breath, well, that's a way to develop some kind of experience with mindfulness. We're talking about being mindful of what is going on in our awareness, in our thoughts. To what degree are we reverting to those habitual tendencies that are not going to solve the problem? They're only going to exacerbate our suffering. Versus, to what degree are we adopting new ways of thinking that are in line with reality? Introspection is the tool by which we check up to see whether our minds are actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. You often refer to this as like a spy in the corner of our mind. In meditation, it's used to kind of check up and see if our meditation is where it's supposed to be, our mindfulness of the breath or whatever it is that we're meditating on. In our daily life, though, introspection is really important because if we're not checking in occasionally to see how are things going, then we can stay on those tracks for quite some time. We just go on autopilot and we just keep going. We need to have some kind of investigation going on. Sometimes this word introspection is also called alertness. It's an ability to be aware of what's happening in our minds. Because sometimes we lose our mindfulness and then we need to correct things. By the way, the fifth chapter of Master Shantideva's text, Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, is really important to study in regard to those two features of mindfulness and introspection. The last one I'm putting on there is curiosity. Which this is a word that, again, we don't use that much in Buddhism. I think curiosity is a really helpful thing. Certainly, even in our culture, we've kind of been at a deficit of curiosity in terms of each other, in terms of what people are thinking, why they are thinking the way that they are thinking. Here, we're primarily directing that curiosity at ourselves, being curious about our own minds. Some of what we're going to see isn't going to be pretty necessarily. It's not going to be something we like to see, that we embrace and say, oh, good, I've got that in me. We might look at it and go, oh, no, that's happening in there. I need to correct that. I need to rectify that. But we have to be somewhat curious. We're talking about our inner world. We spend so much time focused on the external world, in our culture, in our daily lives, what have you, fixing this, tweaking that so that we have this kind of flow of experience that we enjoy. We need to be as curious about our inner world and what are the factors that bring us greater peace of mind. Some of this isn't going to happen immediately. It's hard looking at your own stuff. So know that once more, this is not a quick fix. This isn't an immediate thing where we flip a switch and suddenly all the negative thoughts have gone away, all the positive thoughts are there. We have to be somewhat curious about what is the effect of these things. Maybe in the moment, it's not exactly what we're aiming for, but over time, when we adopt these ways of looking at things, these techniques of mind training, we'll begin to see a more positive, more beneficial effect on our minds. We'll be more even-keeled. We won't be going like the yo-yo, up and down every single day, all over the place, right? So be curious. I'm going to introduce you once more to our text, just in terms of what we're going to be using for this. First of all, just the origins of the Lojong teachings do center around the story of Lama Atisha, who I mentioned earlier. 1,000 years ago, he made some incredible journeys. He was quite the traveler, as many of you know. He did a 13-month voyage from India to Sumatra to receive teachings from his guru, Sir Lingpa, who's also known as Dharmakirti of Suvarnadvipa. This is kind of where he acquired the full range of teachings that have to do with cultivating the awakening mind, bodhicitta, which include these lojong teachings. He was invited then into Tibet. He ended up spending a good the last years of his life in Tibet, and he composed many wonderful texts that were used, that continue to be used in our Tibetan tradition. He also, of course, brought in the teachings of mind training, lojong. So the second bullet point there, one of the primary texts that's used in the study and practice of lojong is Geshe Chikawa's 7-point mind training that came directly from teachings Lama Atisha gave to his heart disciple, Dromtonpa. Dromtonpa was his main Tibetan disciple. Dromtonpa then taught several other great masters of this lojong lineage. I might mention here at this point that these teachings were actually given initially in secret. You know, we live at a time now where these teachings are widely disseminated. And I even hear about Christians practicing some of these teachings and people outside of the Buddhist faith that find benefit to these teachings. When they were first introduced, though, they were secret. They were only disseminated in a guru-disciple relationship in a private environment. And that's because these teachings can be misinterpreted very easily, and they are very difficult to practice. Don't let that intimidate you, though. They're extremely effective if you apply them in the right way. In fact, Geshe Chikawa, the story about Geshe Chikawa is that he had a brother who was a really hard nut, really hard case. He was not going to budge away from his stubborn ways of being and what have you. And so Geshe Chikawa just kind of knew this about his brother, and so he would continue to teach his disciples in secret. Well, the story is that one day his brother was listening to the teachings from the other side of the wall, in this yard that they were going through the teachings. Geshe Chikawa didn't know this, but he began to see changes in his brother. And he was like, what's going on here? Then he found out that his brother had been listening to the teachings in secret. And he decided that the teachings needed to be more widely spread because he figured if they could help this hard case of his brother, then they could help anyone. So there's some reassurance there. Even though these are difficult, these are teachings that have been shown over time to have an incredible softening effect on our minds, keeping us from going to those habitual places of anger, frustration, what have you, in the face of our problems, and actually having a more open heart. So these teachings, again, were more widely disseminated by Geshe Chikawa in his 7-point mind training. There's also the wonderful text, very short text called the 8 Verses of Mind Training by Geshe Langri Tangpa. All these amazing teachings, again, that we now have that we can study. The third point that is in that text of these 7 points of mind training by Geshe Chikawa covers this idea of transforming adverse circumstances into the path. And the first slogan, there are a number of slogans in each of the 7 points. The first slogan in that section is, when the environment and its inhabitants overflow with unwholesomeness, transform adverse circumstances into the path to enlightenment. This sounds like our instructions for the next 4 years, right? For many of us, there might be those among you who find that you're very happy with the election results and you're looking forward to 4 years of that. But there are a number of us, and I'll admit that I'm one of them, who are looking at this as, okay, there's going to be some potential stuff to work with coming up here. We're going to see it from our own vantage point, again, how we are having that experience due to our own karma as an adverse circumstance, as many adverse circumstances that we need to transmute into the path. So the text that we're going to be using is essentially an elaboration on that point, as well as giving advice on how to work with even transforming happiness into the path. Because we're still going to have happiness. We might have a lot of difficulty or suffering in the future, but we're also, of course, going to have moments of happiness. And it's important not to get kind of drunk with those, inebriated by those. Now, why am I calling this turning into arrows into flowers? I was a little bit in the description of this course, but I do want to share this story with you of when the Buddha attained enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. This is from John Landau's version of the book that he wrote with illustrations by Janet Brooke for a children's book. So Mara is this kind of malevolent force that's personified here. When Mara and his evil forces tried everything to disturb Siddhartha, Prince Siddhartha, who again became enlightened as the Buddha under the Bodhi tree, They produced a fearful storm and hurled lightning bolts down around him. They churned up a great wind until everything around the Buddha seemed ready to crash down. But beneath the branches of the tree, everything remained calm, protected by the force of Siddhartha's meditation. Mara saw that the storm had no effect, so he turned to his troops and shouted, "Attack!" The whole horde of evil spirits, demons, and nightmare shapes turned against Siddhartha. They ran towards him wildly, yelling blood-curdling screams. They shot poisoned arrows of hate at him, but as these arrows flew towards the prince, they turned into lotus petals and fell harmlessly at his feet. Nothing could disturb the peace of his meditation. So I decided to give this course that title, Turning Arrows into Flowers, based on the Buddha's ability as Prince Siddhartha in his meditation to be able to disarm all of these things that were being flung at him by the hordes of Maras. So I mean, that's one way of looking at it. Of course, there's that also very wonderful title of a book by Thich Nhat Hanh that I could have used, but I've decided to allow Thich Nhat Hanh the honor of coming up with it. No mud, no lotus. Has anyone heard this phrase before? It's also a really wonderful way to look at this topic of mind training, transforming problems or difficulties. Most of you know that the lotus, this amazingly beautiful flower, only grows in the muckiest parts of the water. So if there's a pond where like all the mud and gunk and everything is collected, the lotus will rise up above it and flower, bloom, unsullied by the mud. But it needs the mud to grow. Without the mud, it can't grow. Similar analogy, again, whether you're turning arrows into flowers or whether you're turning mud into lotuses, it's the same idea that we need the gunk. We need the horrible stuff, right? We need the shit. I hate to put it in those blunt words, but that's the reality. Don't think that, again, having a Buddhist path means that everything's all delightful roses and wonderful stuff. Pema Chodron, when she's talking about this topic of transforming adversities into the path, she says it's like some woman that she knows that had another woman come into her life, and she says, "I don't have room for that woman in my sacred space." I mean, that may be your attitude, but that's not meaning that that this is kind of foreign. That person, whoever that is that's challenging you, is part of your sacred space too, right? You can't have this idea that, oh, it's all supposed to be a wonderful, sacred, delicious, delightful space, and all of these other things I have to keep at bay. Eventually, we should get to a point where we even welcome those things in and we go, oh, here, have a seat. Let's talk a bit. Let's figure out what you can teach me. Again, that's a very, very different attitude. So this is the text we're going to be using, again, that we are going to elaborate on this point. We're going to learn these techniques about how to transform our problems into happiness, into the path. The author is Dodrupchen Jigme Tenpe Nyima. Believe it or not, just a 19th century writer mainly into the 20th century. This is a text that has been translated, and the version that you have out there that I showed you earlier, where to retrieve that, is translated by a man named Adam Piercy. I don't know who this is. He's part of what's called Lotsawa House, really wonderful resource of translations of many Tibetan texts. So you may find some other things out there if you go to Lotsawa House's website. The additional source that I'm going to be quoting occasionally is Transforming Problems into Happiness by Lama Zopa Rinpoche. This is an older version of this book. This is his commentary on this same text. I can't recommend this highly enough. It's very thin. It's not a long book to read. Many of the points that I'm touching on, of course, come from here because they come from the text. There's a translation of the text done by Tartang Tulku Tulku Tundap and Harold Talbot. These two translated the text. It's in the back in the appendix. You can use that, and there may be a time or two where I share that translation. But I really like this translation by Adam Piercy. I think you'll find it useful. So again, if you don't have it, haven't printed it out or put it on your tablet or something, I think it's really useful to have in front of you as we go through it. Now, I'm not going to go back and forth to the text. I'm going to stay within my slides as much as possible because occasionally I will share things from Lama Zopa Rinpoche that we can discuss. We can learn from, Rinpoche was such a master of mind training that I feel horribly inadequate in my own training in the face of his words of wisdom. So I hope you don't mind me sharing a few passages from that book. The text by Jigme Tenpe Nyima starts with an homage. Most of the Tibetan texts do have an homage at the beginning, as well as the Indian treatises. I pay homage, in this case, to noble Avalokiteshvara. Avalokiteshvara is the Buddha of compassion, recalling his qualities, forever joyful at the happiness of others and plunged into sorrow whenever they suffer. You have fully realized great compassion with all its qualities and abide without a care for your own happiness or suffering. So he's looking to Avalokiteshvara, the embodiment of the compassion of all the Buddhas, and seeing this as the perfect archetype of what we need to do in developing our own compassion, where we take delight in bringing others to happiness and well-being, and we mourn at the suffering of the world around us. That we, always are in touch with the suffering of others. So what is called here great compassion. I might just take a moment to delineate what we mean by great compassion versus just compassion. Compassion, as most of you know, is the wish for a being, usually others besides ourselves, so we can direct it at ourselves, to be free from suffering and to be free from the causes of suffering. Compassion is a wonderful, wonderful mindset that is again, one of the most fundamental teachings of the Buddha, but is also taught in almost all spiritual traditions, a compassionate response to the suffering of the world. Great compassion is the mind that the Bodhisattva develops as a way of not just being aware of the suffering of others and wanting it to be gone, but wanting to be an instrument of doing that. This is where we wish to protect others from suffering, where we wish to remove their causes of suffering. Now again, if the Buddhas, any being like Tenrezig, Avalokiteshvara, this being who's the embodiment of compassion, if they could remove our suffering, they would have done it by now, right? Because they have that great compassion that wishes to free all beings from their suffering. But they can help beings to remove their suffering once more by teaching the Dharma, by giving them exactly what will be essential to being able to free themselves from suffering. Buddhists don't remove the suffering of others, just on that thought of great compassion. They do so by teaching the Dharma. So this is an important aspect to keep in mind. When the author pays homage to Avalokiteshvara, the Buddha of compassion, it's within the understanding that what we are primarily then taking refuge in as well and paying homage to are the teachings of the Buddhas that are generated from that compassion. Everything the Buddhas have taught has been based on compassion for beings, wanting to help them to be free from suffering. So that's how we are benefited by the Buddhas, and that's how we can actually benefit others, is by helping them to realize the Dharma as well. But eventually we lose this sense, as I said in that last line, of a sort of care or regard for our own happiness or suffering. It becomes quite trivial and insignificant to be attending only to our own well-being when we look at the vast misery and suffering in the world. In that wonderful verse from Master Shantideva that we often recite, that His Holiness is very enamored of. For as long as space exists, as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too abide to dispel the misery of the world. This is what we are trying to accomplish in terms of our path, and to not be so selfishly concerned with our own well-being. Okay, so every slide that is from the text, by the way, I have the page number at the top. So if you're following along with a hard copy of it, this is the sort of statement of intent or a purpose that our author is putting forward. This is also very common at the beginning of these Tibetan and Indian treatises. I am going to put down here a partial instruction on how to use both happiness and suffering as the path to enlightenment. This is indispensable for leading a spiritual life, a most needed tool of the noble ones, and quite the most priceless teaching in the world. We're getting lots of good advertising for it right up front and generate some confidence that, our author is selling us the real deal, not even selling it, giving it to us, free of charge. So I'm going to share a little bit of what Rinpoche says in regard to this being indispensable. He says, it is said, this book was written, by the way, back in the 90s, but that's because this whole era could be called the quarreling age. We are in the quarreling age, an extremely difficult time on this earth, when violence and greed are everywhere. and there are many obstacles to practicing Dharma. Even having encountered the Dharma, you will still find it extremely difficult to continue and succeed in your practice. Inner and outer obstacles will pour down like rain. Now, again, maybe that's not the experience for everybody. Maybe you don't have this torrent of problems and difficulties, but we all have our share. As I pointed out at the very beginning of the class today, anyone in the room who doesn't have any problems or difficulties, we all do. We all know that we have these. The goal is not to let them become obstacles, make you kind of give up and say, oh, what's the point of all this Buddhist practice and stuff? I just keep having difficulties and problems. My life's not getting any better. Well, again, what are we trying to improve? The outside or the inside? That's the measure. So Rinpoche continues. He says, in order to succeed in listening to, reflecting on, and meditating on the graduated path to enlightenment, the Lam Rim, for the benefit and happiness of all sentient beings, you must learn to practice Mahayana thought transformation. This isn't an optional teaching, according to Rinpoche. This is an essential teaching that you actually have to practice in order to become enlightened. Otherwise, again, you're going to be subject to the ebb and flow of things in your life. You're never going to be kind of in that place where you can use it all in the path, where you are not subject to that vacillation. Transforming miserable conditions into necessary conditions that help us move along the path to enlightenment has great benefit, especially in the exceptionally difficult times in which we live. And this wasn't rewritten for some modern edition. This was written back in, again, in the 90s. Rinpoche was teaching this way throughout his life. All the great masters of the past taught this way. Go back 1,000 years when Lama Atisha brought these teachings to Tibet. Life was that way. It's not like suddenly we are in this place where there's a lot more problems than there ever have been, but they might be exacerbated to some degree, certainly, by the world in which we live in that has become inundated with afflictions and erroneous ways of looking at things. Okay, so back to our text. There are two parts to our text. The bulk of it is going to be the first one, how to use suffering as the path. The second is how to use happiness as the path. Again, you might think, well, what do I need to learn that about? But His Holiness pointed out that's also a problematic time for us when everything is going well, when, it seems like our life is a vacation all of a sudden. Maybe that doesn't happen for very long, but you can become, again, very prideful at those times or even complacent. Each one is approached firstly through relative truth and then through absolute truth. Now, these aren't the terms that we tend to use sometimes in our tradition. Let me just explain what we mean by them very briefly. We will see them as we go through it. Relative truth means in a conventional manner, understanding the way that causes and conditions are arising and so on, looking at it through the lens of the teachings that the Buddha gave that are essentially what we call the method teachings. Method meaning one half of the teachings that help us to understand the mechanisms by which we have an effect on our experience, especially karma, but also many other teachings that we're going to be looking at. The other side of it that pertains to absolute truth or ultimate truth gets at a deeper investigation of how things exist. This is where we come into understanding the wisdom of emptiness, seeing that things don't have the attributes that we are attributing to them, the giving to them, because of a deeper investigation into how they actually exist. So we are going to see how to transform suffering into the path first through a number of techniques that work with the conventional, relative truth, and then we're going to look at how we work with them in terms of a deeper understanding of emptiness, of absolute truth, all right? And we'll do the same with regard to happiness. Again, that'll be at the end of the course, and I'll probably zip through it because at that point I'll be so far behind. All right. Through relative truth, how to use suffering as the path. Whenever we are harmed by sentient beings or anything else, if we make a habit out of perceiving only the suffering, then when even the smallest problem comes up, it will cause enormous anguish in our mind. I've talked about this already, so I'm not going to spend maybe as much time on it. We are defining how to look at something. Rinpoche says this is because the nature of any perception or idea, be it happiness or sorrow, is to grow stronger and stronger the more we become accustomed to it. So as the strength of this pattern gradually builds up, before long, we'll find that just about everything we perceive becomes a cause for actually attracting unhappiness towards us. And happiness will never get a chance. kind of like see our whole world through the lens of defining everything as being a problem, suffering, difficulty. Rinpoche goes on to say, you cannot stop your suffering by identifying as a problem some harm that has come to you or some undesirable situation that has arisen, and then thinking over and over again that the condition is a problem. We create the problem. You are the creator of what you call a problem. You can choose to see it otherwise. When you encounter an undesirable situation, a thought arises that interprets your experience as a problem, and that in and of itself causes suffering. And that sounds kind of simplistic, but it's quite profound. The only way to stop that suffering, Rinpoche says, is to give rise to another thought that recognizes and interprets your experience as happiness. Only this thought can stop that suffering. Only this thought can quell the unhappy mind. Now, does that mean that we just simply are like deluding ourselves and we're going to say, okay, I'm having this horrible, unpleasant thing. I'm sick in bed with this ailment or whatever, and I'm going to choose to see it as happiness? Well, it means that you also have a deeper understanding that there is a rich minefield there that we can kind of go in and get the things that we want out of it, that we're going to improve our understanding and development of realizations. It's an understanding that those things we identify as problems that we give that label to actually are rich in opportunity. Otherwise, again, it just becomes kind of a, I don't know if certainly psychologists would question you identifying this. You have come in and you just have all these problems and difficulties, but you're just simply saying, oh, but I'm happy, deluding yourself into thinking you're happy when all these things are creating problems for you. We're not talking about it being that simplistic. We're talking about being able to see that what is arising in our field of experience is really, really, really powerful and wonderful stuff that can be transmuted, can be transformed. That's the idea behind it. Let me just see if I want to share one or two slides, but I want to see if there's any questions as well, and we're kind of towards the end. Rinpoche says, if we do not realize that, no, this is, I'm sorry, from our text. This is from our text. If we do not realize that, it all depends on the way in which mind develops this habit. And instead, we put the blame on external objects and situations alone. The flames of suffering, negative karma, aggression, and so on will spread like wildfire without end. Rinpoche says this is what is called all appearances arising as enemies. This is what essentially is going on, is that we are choosing to identify these as problems, as difficulties, see them as suffering, and then everything gets seen through that lens. So the homework that I want you to work on, you can continue reading in terms of the text and get familiar with what is all in the text. There's no problem with reading ahead. Next week, we will start getting into the individual techniques, again, starting with relative truth. But just pay attention in your own daily life. To what degree are you framing what you experience as some level of suffering, giving you that type of a feeling of unpleasantness, what have you? To what degree are you identifying it as a problem and then relating to it in that way? And you begin to see that there might be something that once more is like a mirror being held up to us that we can say, oh, I can actually learn something nice from that, something that's valuable from that. Just like a mirror shows, where we might have something that we need to change or to, have some medication or whatever to remove or whatever, all of that is a wonderful opportunity. It all depends on how we choose to look at it, though. If you want to look at it as a problem and do everything you can to force it out of your life, well, that's one way to work with it. If you want to welcome it in and say, okay, what is this going to teach me? Then that's a whole nother perspective. We open it up to any questions or comments from folks online as well as here in the Gompa. We do have a microphone in the Gompa. If you are sharing anything, raise your hand and we'll get you the microphone so everyone can hear.
Any questions in the Gompa?
Leah. We're so excited to get a question.
Thank you. Okay. Sometimes the problem is vast and has lots of components.
Sure.
I know that I can't deal with it. So I just want to go and I can't do it right right now, so I have to sequester myself.
Mhm.
Is that a really horrible thing to do?
No, no,
Like,
no.
I mean, it's, yeah.
I think we're going to talk about this more, Leah, in regard to, I think it's coming up in this next section that's in the text. There's that wonderful verse from Master Shantideva that I'm sure I'll mention it again next week when we get to this, where Shantideva actually says, if it's something that we can do something about, then why be unhappy? If it's something we can't do anything about, then what's the point in being unhappy? Everything that we encounter has different dimensions to it, and it might even depend upon our individual perspective initially. So let's say you're talking about, the complexities of some of what's going on in our world. Let's look at climate change, for example. It is very hard to say, okay, understanding to some degree the causes and conditions that have led to us having this occur in our world and all the various ways that it's manifesting in terms of climate problems and changes and difficulties, what have you. It seems like sort of hiding our head in the sand is a much better response than trying to engage in it in a way that is so overwhelming, right? So we might look at it and initially go, well, there's not much I can do about that, but it still means we can do some work on our own minds. There are some things in the world that we cannot have an immediate effect upon. Now, I'm not saying that in climate change that falls necessarily in that category. You can do some things, right? You can make individual choices about what you are doing, what you are consuming, how you are going about living your life, and so on. I'm not going to totally ignore that. But the reality is we're talking here about our own minds. And what is our mind going to say in relation to this going on in our world? Are we going to choose to try to accept this, to see this as a reality that we might not be able to have an effect on at the large scale that we would ideally like to? But still, the work needs to be done to work on our own minds, to keep our hearts open, to keep our compassion for all beings who are going through the difficulties that are a product of all those actions that we've engaged in the past. Or again, as Master Shantideva says, or is it something we can do something about? Some problems might be really overwhelming like that, and we can't do very much. But it doesn't mean we can't do anything. We can do something. So initially, sure, when we have that kind of being bombarded by something that is quite overwhelming, we might need to pull ourselves back. We might need to lick our wounds a little bit and go, okay, I need to nurture myself. I need to have compassion for myself in looking at this overwhelming situation. But that's not the end product. It's to come back out of that with a renewed sense of being attentive to and quite open to the suffering of the world, with a mind that is compassionate and wanting to do whatever we can to alleviate that suffering. Did you want to share any more, Leah, from that?
Yeah.
No.
It's just humongous.
It's humongous. Sure.
And it's like, and you got other people depending on you, and the story of my life. No, but I'm just saying.
Yeah.
It can be too much, and it's hard to, like, I don't know.
No, I know what you're
Yeah.
saying. I know what you're saying, and I'm not. You've got your own experience. I'm trying to validate that and honor that it's not the same experience as me. But the reality is that we do need to have our moments of self-compassion. Really briefly, there's a wonderful self-compassion break. I'll put it out on the materials. So if you go to the same materials link that's at the website, that'll be out there. Kristen Neff, who's done a lot of research into self-compassion, she does this little 3-step self-compassion break. One is you acknowledge that what you're going through is really difficult, that it's a moment of suffering. We don't do that for ourselves very often, right? We just skirt over and go, toughen up. We like that sort of Western mentality, that Lone Ranger mentality of just toughen up and get through it, right? We don't give ourselves the space to say, what I'm going through is really, really hard right now. It's really difficult. Secondly, we recognize that that's part of our shared humanity. That universalizes it a bit, that we recognize that we're not in our own little bubble here of suffering, suffering, suffering with nobody else experiencing anything. We are part of the collective experience that's going on in this world. Thirdly, we nurture ourselves with words that we say to ourselves that help us to feel that compassionate embrace, and even hold our heart or whatever is necessary, saying, I wish you were free of this. I wish that I wasn't experiencing this. I wish that this problem was gone. There's nothing wrong with having those thoughts. Those are wholesome thoughts. And we might come out of that with a renewed sense of working with those problems because they're probably still going to be there. But we have to treat ourselves with compassion. So again, I'll put that little compassion break out there, but I think it's really important that when we see, especially things that look quite overwhelming, that are like they're huge, we just can't even think about how to get our heads around it, that we then acknowledge that this is difficult. And we need to also be responsive to others, but first tend to ourselves. And if we look at bodhicitta, this mind that wishes to become a Buddha for the sake of others, it's essentially telling us to do that. We have to tend to ourselves and make ourselves qualified so we then can help others more perfectly, right? In our current situation, we can't do that. So the same thing, when we have suffering in our world, we need to become more aware of our own suffering, be attentive to it, and then come out of it with a renewed sense of being able to dedicate ourselves to helping others. Okay? Yeah. There may be a question
Thank
on
you.
that.
There are next, Richard, would you like to unmute? We've got 3 more questions, Richard, and then Eli, and then Amanda.
Oh, wow. Okay, we may want to take a few of these down. I don't want to keep people here too late. I don't know who came in first. Richard?
Yes,
Please, Richard.
thank you. Are we going to learn some techniques to know when we are deluding ourselves that we are happy even though we're suffering? I guess I'm worried that sometimes we do gloss over some of the suffering and we think that perhaps, you know, we ignore it or we think we're
Mhm.
happy with it.
Right.
That's something that I would be worried about.
Again, I don't think that we want to do kind of what you're saying, to gloss over it. The way that I work with this in my life is that I always start with that point of acknowledging that what I'm experiencing is suffering. It's a bit like that first point of the self-compassion meditation. If we don't start there, then we don't have anything to transform. It's kind of like the idea, it's an alchemical process, but you have to start with the baser stuff. You have to start with that as a suffering experience. What we mean by a suffering experience, essentially, and I'm going to talk more about this in future classes, is that you are registering, we're always registering one type of feeling or another. We're registering an unpleasant feeling, a pleasant feeling, or a neutral feeling. We're talking about something here that is giving us an unpleasant feeling. It's giving us some mental anguish or some physical pain or something that we are plugged into that says, this is unpleasant. That's all that's really happening. Everything else are thoughts on top of that. But you have to start with acknowledging that this is something that is producing an unpleasant feeling. This is something that is a moment of suffering. Again, the labeling beyond that is where we change our way of looking at it on the basis of seeing it as an opportunity to practice and to deepen our understanding. But it doesn't change what it starts with. Everything is going to start from a moment of suffering. So don't gloss over that. Don't ignore that. Bring that into our experience and go, okay, here's the grist for the mill. Here's the moment of suffering that I can work with. Initially, you might need to work with lesser moments of suffering, things that are a little more handleable, is that a word? Things that are within our reach of something that we can get our heads around and our hearts around. But the goal is to be able to work with anything that is a moment of suffering and to transmute it, to welcome it in and say, okay, there's something to be learned here, something that I can work with, something that I can deepen my own progress on the path. So I hope that that gives some guidance on it. There might be certain times where it feels very overwhelming, like back to Leah's question, where it's so monumental that we have to just crawl in our room and under the covers and spend an hour or two just nurturing ourselves in order to come back out and say, okay, I've got to roll up my sleeves and do the work or whatever. But the goal is to be able to transmute whatever it is that we meet, to be open to all of it, regardless of what's happening. Even the most horrific things are still capable of being transformed. Okay. I'm at a bit of a loss as to what to do with some of the questions we have. Is there a way that one of you could copy those down? Just highlight them. There's a way of copying the thing, I think, but I can never do that quite right.
Absolutely. And if you have not dropped your question into the chat, Zoom chat, please do, and we'll copy it and we'll have it for next week. Thank you.
Amanda, is that okay? Okay, all right, Amanda, we'll get it in there, or send it along, to whoever, to Venerable Dundrup or one of us, and we'll make sure that we, beginning of next week, I'll try to start with these questions. All right. Okay. Let's do our dedication prayers. So when everyone clear on your homework is to pay attention to your mind, how you are framing problems, see if you can start to work with that. And let's recite these wonderful verses from Master Shantideva's text.
May all beings everywhere,
Everywhere,
plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits.
Oops. There we go. May no
May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with the mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. And then the long life prayer for His Holiness. Gangri Rawe Korwe Jing Kandir Pendang Dewa Malu Zhongwei Ne Shen Re Zing Wa Tenzing Gatso Yi Jape Si Te Bardu Tengu Chi. And also in our hearts, we pray for the swift return of Lama Zopa Rinpoche. We also pray for the long lives of all of our teachers. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you all. Thank you, Mary, for leading the prayers. Thank you all for being here today. And again, we'll continue on this text for the next 3 Saturdays. Rinpoche's book takes very little time to read, and feel free to pick that up and to read that as well. I'm sure we have copies in the library as well, I'm sure. All right, everyone, have a good week. And if you don't have a good week, identify it as a source of happiness. Well, all right, bye-bye.